welcome all to iLearn Delhi's Mon India session. Okay, my name is Shivaprasad and we'll be handling the Mon India and post-independence consolidation part for you guys. Okay, see, Mon India is a very important subject as far as the UPSC is concerned. One thing is, Mon India carries a big weightage as far as the UPSC examination goes by. Okay, with regards to the prelims examination, there are around 8 questions asked per year in Mon India, whereas for the mains examination there are around 3 to 4 questions. Okay, so somewhere near 3 to 4 questions. So this is the weightage of the subject of Mon India. The other one is Mon India is considered to be a subject that is relatively simpler than the others, only if you prepare in the right way. Okay, as you all know, it is a very factually dense subject and thus requires the processing of a lot of information. Okay, now I will help you guys channelize your preparations into the right areas, okay, and give you the right perspective about the subject. Okay, so this is as far as the general aspects of the subject is concerned. Okay, you must also realize that at least around 80 to 90% of Mon India questions can be answered by a very good candidate. Okay, I will ensure you that part. I'll ensure that you can answer 100% provided that you use the right tools during your examination. Okay, so let's just travel through the subject together. This is a journey through history, of course. So let's just travel through the subject together. Okay, now these are the standard reference materials that you see. Okay, that is Themes of Indian History Part 3. Okay, which is a very important material for your Modern India class. Modern India, Old NCERT, another very important material. So is Spectrum. See, Spectrum Modern India is considered to be the standard reference material as far as the UPSC examination is concerned. Now there are 2 caveats that I'd like to add there. One must remember that Spectrum is a book that is created exclusively for the UPSC examination, and thus isn't a standard reference material as far as the subject of history is concerned. Okay, it is a standard reference material as far as the UPSC aspirant is concerned. So it is highly unlikely that a UPSC examiner would frame his question from this particular book. Okay, so this is something that one must remember. So this is a caveat that I would like to add there. Okay, so now what I will attempt in the in my class is that I will give you the requisite info that will enable you to eliminate the use of Spectrum. I personally do not prefer Spectrum because it is of course a standard reference material. It has a lot of information but rather unorganized. Okay, so my task is to structure your information, layer it in such a way for which I have decided to create handouts. Okay, so for every session we will have handouts which will be posted to you guys, and we will take the session via our handouts. Okay, it will be a mixture of handouts as far as certain presentations. Where you require imagery, we will use presentations. Where you require handouts, I'll be giving you the handouts. Okay, so it will be a rather interactive session. Okay, so hold tight, sit tight, everybody. Okay, now these other standard reference materials are the NCERTs, the old NCERT being one of the most important. One must remember that Spectrum is actually the compilation of India's struggle for independence, okay, which is Bipan Chandra's most famous historical work. Okay, so the old NCERT becomes irrelevant once you read Spectrum. Okay, but since we have decided to eliminate Spectrum from our preparation journey by exclusively depending on my handouts, you guys will have to refer to the old NCERT, okay, and Themes of Indian History. These are certain books that you must refer because these are standard books. When you refer standard books, what happens is there are greater possibilities that the UPSC will frame questions from these books because they are standard reference books with regards to the UPSC questionnaires too. Okay, so that is something that we must remember. Spectrum isn't, because it's the book that has been exclusively created for the UPSC examination. Okay, now I hope you have understood my idea with regards to reference materials. Now let's move on. Okay, now let's look at the trend analysis. With regards to the prelims examination, there are at least around 8 questions per year. Okay, this is something that we realized after going through the UPSC question paper starting from 2011 to 19. Okay, so I'll give you certain other patterns later on. Okay, so we will discuss about the various patterns and all that later on. Okay, only after you have a firm grasp of the subject can you get into such, can you delve into such nuances. Okay, that is why I'm stopping my analysis here. We will have it further as we go along. Okay, now mains examination. On an average, 4 questions in the UPSC for the mains examination. Okay, 3 to 4 questions. It varies each year. Okay, so remember that too. 2018 witnessed a surge in the number of questions from this section. 2018 was a remarkable year for modern India history as such. The UPSC carried around 4 questions in history. Okay, which is the highest level, which is the highest ever they have reached. With regards to the prelims examination, around 13 questions were asked from modern India. So this is another surprising development that one must remember. Okay, so these are certain aspects that one must remember. This is with regards to the importance of the subject and the as far as the UPSC is concerned. Okay, so I hope I have given you a rough idea about the general trend in the subject. Okay, now I'll try substantiating my argument by presenting you certain graphical evidence. Okay, look at this prelims question. Look at the trend. Okay, 8, 9, 7, 4, 7 on the whole. 7 to 8 questions from modern India. You can see a sudden increase in the in 2018, which is surprising, and you can see 2 new graphs. Okay, this is post-independence. This is considered the newest addition to the UPSC exam as far as the prelims examination is concerned. So we'll deal with post-independence separately. We will restrict ourselves to modern India, but I just wanted to show you the trend there. Even with regards to post-independence, this is the trend. Okay, post-independence used to be an area that was one of the UPSC's favorite topic as far as GS1 mains examination was concerned at one point of time. We talk about 2012 and 13, there are around 4 to 5 questions from post-independence. But unfortunately, it has declined over time with no questions appearing after 2015. Okay, but now it has made a sudden re-emergence in the prelims examination. Okay, from being from being in the decline in the mains examination, it has re-emerged in the prelims examination. Okay, so this is something that you must understand. Okay, so this is a significant trend that we'll have to lay out. So this is the idea that I have to give. So look at the, I hope you have understood the graphical trend. With 2018, you see a new dot, a new infant. Okay, there, the newest addition to the UPSC examination, which is post-independence consolidation. This is mains examination and its trend. Look at the questions, roughly around 4 questions every year. 2018 witnessed a dip. Okay, but you must realize that there are certain questions in the GS1 paper which cannot be classified either as society or history. So I have excluded them because they will be dealt with by other faculties. Okay, but nonetheless, if there is a question with regards to women organizations, question with regards to communalism, all of which has an importance with regards to pre-independence India as well as post-independence India. So that also can be classified as part of Indian history. But what we have done here is we have excluded that and then given it exclusively to the society part. Okay, so please remember. So this is the trend with as far as the mains examinations concerned. Look at post-independence there. I have not included 2012 because it cannot be considered as a standard pattern for the current examination model. That's why we have started from 2013 actually. As far as the mains examination is concerned, your standard pattern starts from 2013. As far as the prelims examination is concerned, your standard pattern starts from 2012 actually. But there are few questions which are good from 2011. So that is the reason I have included that too. Otherwise, the standard pattern starts from 2012. Okay, with regards to your mains, standard pattern starts from 2013. Okay, so I have one clear up to this point. Okay, so this is the analysis that I have to give you about modern India. Okay, now we look at the most important part, the various topics related to modern India. Okay, we'll be looking at it in the next slide. Okay, see, these are the various topics. British consolidation of India. This is the first part we'll be covering. Okay, the British consolidation of India. The first set of handouts covers the British consolidation of India. The second set of handouts covers its administrative changes. So we'll be talking about this later on. We'll be analyzing about this particular sections later on. Now, how will we start history? British consolidation. What happens? First starts European penetration. Okay, so my handouts have been divided in such a way so as to give you a firm understanding about the various events. We've got around 23 handouts on the whole. Okay, go through that. That will suffice both for your prelims as well as the mains. It has been time tested, so don't worry. I have an experience of over 6 years with regards to this field. So 6 years at Thailand, 2 years before that. Okay, so please don't worry about it. We've got it covered basically. So European penetration is the first section that we'll be covering here. Okay. Then comes the various wars. How did the British consolidate, or the how British expansion in India is the second chapter. Okay. We need to also delve into the decline of the Mughal Empire and the rise of regional states. Decline of Mughal Empire and rise of regional states. Okay, so these are very important aspects with regards to this particular section. Decline of the Mughal Empire and rise of regional states. Okay, now this is as far as this section is concerned. Now what happened here? Administrative changes. See, after the British managed to consolidate their power in India, what did they do? They slowly and steadily brought in administrative changes. Okay, they slowly and steadily brought in administrative changes. Now, what can be classified or categorized as part of administrative changes? You could say that the land revenue systems could be considered as part of administrative changes. Then, the evolution of the civil services, another important trend in administrative changes. Then, the education system, another very important trend in administrative changes. Okay, judiciary. So these are the aspects that we'll be covering in this particular section. This is important as far as the prelims as well as the mains are concerned. You must remember that administrative sections was explored in a large way in the 2018 prelims examination. Okay, so that is something that a candidate must be well aware about. Okay. So please remember that too. Now, the next section that we'll be covering is economic history of India. Okay, economic history of India. What does that deal with? Now, let me ask you a question. Let me just go back a bit. Administrative changes. What comes as part of the land revenue systems? You may have learned about it in your school days, during your school days. What are the various land revenue systems introduced by the British? Do you remember? You may have a faint memory about something known as the permanent settlement system. You may have a very faint memory about it, the permanent settlement system. Okay, then comes the Rayotwari system. Just a faint memory would suffice. You don't need to know about it. We'll be learning about it in detail in our classes, so don't worry about it. I just wanted to once again awoken the grey cells there. Okay, the memory glands there. It may be somewhere there. Okay, I just wanted to shake it up. Okay, so Rayotwari. Next is Mahalwari. Okay, so these are things that you may have studied in your school days. I just wanted to remind you about that. We'll be covering about all that in detail. Okay, so don't worry. Now, we will be moving into the next part, economic history of India. What is so important about economic history of India? Can you tell me? What is so important about economic history of India? See, economic history of India encompasses the most demeaning aspects, the most deleterious aspects of the British Raj. You must remember that. So the British Raj came here, exploited the country, ruined it and left. Okay, the India that was left after India was left in ruination by the British after their exploits here. See, I will reiterate this once more. Let me give you a stat there. Okay, a historian known as Angus Maddison, very famous British historian of the name Angus Maddison, after taking an analytical study, okay, doing a lot of data interpretation, found out that at least around 24% of global manufacturing GDP in the 17th century came from India, came from just one place, that was India. Okay, maybe China was the only power that may have had a greater manufacturing capability, but China had slowly receded from the economic scenario in the 16th century after they decided to follow the principle of isolation. Okay, India had become the global manufacturing hub of the world. Indian textiles were of great demand across the world. Okay, so that is something that one must know. Okay, if you have heard about Robinson Crusoe, okay, see Robinson Crusoe, the writer of Robinson Crusoe, Defoe, okay, once lamented that Indian cloth was dominating everything in England and there was not a single piece of English cloth to be seen anywhere. Okay, so Defoe, the writer of Robinson Crusoe, laments the same thing. So that is how good our manufacturing was. That is how epic our manufacturing was at one point of time, especially in textiles. Even the great Karl Marx described us as the mother of cotton textiles. You don't have to write any of this now. We'll be discussing about this in detail. I just wanted to give the impact or the total impact of the British rule in India with regards to the economic scenario. Okay, so remember that too. So economic history, what we'll be learning here? We'll be learning about deindustrialization, how the British ruined our handicrafts, especially textile industries. We'll be learning about drain of wealth here. Okay, the drain of wealth theory here. We'll also be learning about the economic critique, how our early nationalists decided to essentially create a critique of colonialism, which gave the ground for future national movements. So this was the ideological background of future national movements. The economic critique, they highlighted about the sinister effects of British colonial exploits, okay, exploitation, especially in the economic sector. Okay, after all, the entire colonial enterprise was based on economic exploitation. One must remember. Okay, remember about what I said. Angus Maddison, 24% of world GDP in the 17th century or the 18th century, in fact, came from India. What was the subsequent figure in the beginning of the 21st century or beginning of the 20th century? What was the subsequent figure in the beginning of 1900, the early decades of 1900? It was 2%. So India's manufacturing GDP plunged from 24% in 1700 to 2.2 to 2.5% in 1900. So a drop of around 22 percentage points in GDP capacity. Okay, or in GDP generation. This is what happened. That is the kind of exploitation that the country had to face under the British tenure. So please to remember that. So this cannot be considered as you may have known about a lot of other things, but this is the kind of impact that we had to face. Okay. Now, so it is against this pernicious practice that the early nationalists decided to create a critique. Okay, they literally formulated a criticism against all this, where they highlighted a lot of things. Okay, deindustrialization, the destruction of agriculture, and all that was highlighted here. Okay, that is why the agriculture scenario, all that was highlighted here. Okay, now let's move on. After the economic critique was formulated, we had a solid ground for the solid ideological ground for the launch of a mass movement. So now the only challenge before that lay ahead of us was to convince the masses about all this. Okay, the masses had been in a slumber or were in a sleep for a long time. Okay, their hard labor was being sucked away to Britain. Okay, so that is the kind of mistreatment that we had to face from the hands of the British. The British never formally mistreated us, was never actually formally mistreated us in a very bad way. They are not actually as evil as the Germans, for example, the Nazis, but their long-standing or their effects over a long period was much more than what the Germans actually did across the world. That is the kind of economic exploitation that they carried out in their colonial empires. Okay, so that is something that we must realize, we must understand. Now, this is how the early nationalistic phase starts. Okay, who are the early nationalists? They were known as the moderates. We are talking about the pre-Congress organizations, those organizations which rose before the Indian National Congress. The moderates, which was the first group or who are the founder, who laid the foundations of the Indian National Congress, the moderates of the INC. We'll be learning about all that. So don't be too worried about all this. This will be a walk in the park. Okay, after we finish our classes. So please don't worry about anything like that. Okay, we are just giving you an introduction. So I wanted you to know the rough aspects of the subject. Okay, that is something that I want you to experience. Okay, so this is what happened. Pre-Congress organizations, rise of the moderates and the extremists. Okay, then rose the extremists, another faction within the Indian National Congress, led by people like Bal Gangadhar Tilak. You may have heard about that man, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Lala Rajpat Rai, the great Aurobindo Ghosh. These are the leaders of the extremist faction. We'll be learning about that too. Then comes the Gandhian phase, the later nationalistic phase, the Gandhian phase, the emergence of the great Mahatma Gandhi, the father of the nation, the man who defined this century for India. Okay, there are very little people who can be considered as forerunners or as statesmen or as forerunners to the development of a nation. Okay, Gandhi was responsible for the making of a nation. Okay, so we will be looking at the Gandhian movements and the rise of the Indian National Congress's stalwarts, people like Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, etc. So the Gandhian movements is what we'll be covering in this particular phase. Okay, the Gandhian phase, which ultimately led to independence. If I may remind you, I hope you remember about the non-cooperation movement. This is something that you may have learned in your school days. Okay, the civil disobedience movement. Certainly, a candidate or an aspirant will be aware about the Dandi March, the Salt March. Okay, which took place during the time of the civil disobedience movement. The Quit India movement. Okay, something that all of you must be aware about. The Quit India movement. So please to remember that. Okay. So these are all things that you must realize. Okay. Now, so remember about all this. So ultimately, after all this, India gained independence, and unfortunately, the father of the nation was shot dead at point blank. India has to be ashamed before the world because it's one of the few nations to have murdered its own founding father. Okay, unfortunately, you must also remember that we are one of the few nations who actually murdered its founding father, one of its founding fathers. Okay, or the most important founding father. You rarely hear about that anywhere else. Okay, it was there in other places. For example, Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was murdered. He is considered to be Bangabandhu or father of Bangladesh. But India too falls in that unfortunate list. Okay, so there are certain standalone topics which we'll have to learn in between two. Social reform organizations. We are talking about social reformers, people who tried tackling the inherent issues, intrinsic issues, which were well rooted in India's society. Okay, there are lots of societal issues that India had, which we still face even today. Can you tell me some of them? Of course, patriarchy. Okay, thus women still remain largely unempowered. Okay, unfortunately, women still remain unempowered. That's not the case with Western nations. Okay, patriarchy, social evils. There are lots of social evils which were prevalent in the country. If you remember, a widow had to burn the funeral pyre after the demise of her husband. This very pernicious or evil practice was known as sati. Okay, so if you remember that particular practice, do you know who abolished sati? We'll be learning about that later on. Ram Mohan Roy, you may have heard about. Do you know what inspired Ram Mohan Roy to do it? It was because his own sister, his own very sister, actually passed away by doing that deed. She also did that deed, and he had to see it in the front of his eyes. That is when he was very disappointed and very angry. That's how, that was a life-changing moment for Ram Mohan Roy, who then decided to consequently launch a campaign to abolish sati. So he can be considered one of the father of modern India actually. First father of modern India actually, Ram Mohan Roy. Remember that man's name. There are lots of others. Every state would have its own set of social reformers. Okay, for example, Tamil Nadu, Periyar, great social reformer. Okay, Tamil Nadu, the state of Tamil Nadu, the Dravida movement, which was meant to uplift the backward classes. Okay, Subbalakshmi, another very great social reformer from Tamil Nadu. Annie Besant was somebody who hailed from or who was a resident in Tamil Nadu, in Chennai for a long time. Andhra Pradesh, can you tell me one name? Veerasalingam Pantulu, very famous reformer. Okay, so each state may have its own set of reformers. Bal Shastri Jambekar, Maharashtra, Jyotiba Phule, B.R. Ambedkar, all of them hail from Maharashtra. Okay, so each state will have its own set of reformers. Okay, Bengal has a lot of them. So does Maharashtra. So does South India. So does Northwest India. Okay, so we need to look at those heroes who sacrificed their lives. Okay, to improve, to better, to bring in, or to usher in, or to better society. Okay, so these heroes will be. We will look about the lives of these heroes in this particular section, social reforms. Okay, so this is a standalone section. Rebels and the Raj. Now, what is this section all about? See, the earlier rules of the British did create a lot of resentment among the masses. Even prior to the national movement, there was some sort of patriotic zeal that was there that could be gauged at least at the regional level. We are not talking about nationalism here. We are talking about patriotism, regional patriotism. See, even when the British started extending their administrative systems into the country, a lot of classes felt disenchanted. Okay, so many of them decided to oppose this particular measure, and thus there are lots of rebellions. Okay, so this cannot be considered as part of the national movements because they did not originate out of a feeling of nationhood, but rather due to some regional resentment. Okay, so you must classify that separately. So these can be classified as, they can be classified, that's why we put that section together, rebels and the Raj, civil rebellions. Okay, can be brought under this particular thing. Now, what is civil rebellions? Us, normal civilians, taking up arms against the British. Now, civil rebellions can be roughly classified into three actually. One being peasant rebellions. Okay, the other being tribal rebellions. Okay, then you can also sometimes bring in the rebellions of native states under this category, or you can bring it out too. So, rebellion of native states, certain native states decide to rebel against the British Raj. Now, ultimately what happened? All this culminated in the first phase, at least in the revolt of 1857. So, one of the most important topics of rebels and the Raj is the revolt of 1857, which was described to be the first war of independence by Karl Marx first actually, then V.D. Savarkar in 1910. Okay, the revolt of 1857, the first war of independence. Okay, so this is the area that we will be looking at in this particular chapter. Okay, so but this is a lesser this is an area that is that has been very rarely there in the UPSC's question scanner. Okay, so this is the so the priority that you'll have to accord is lower here. Okay, now along in this section we'll have to add a third section too. So we've so far had two sections. One is rebels and the Raj, includes civil rebellions and also rebellion from native states. Okay, now the third thing is revolutionary movements. If you know, can you tell me? We'll just okay, so we'll just so revolutionary movements. Can you tell me what is there in the various revolutionary movements? Okay, so what are the important tenets of revolutionary movements? We could also include revolutionary movements within this fold. Okay, so there was a technical interruption. I'm sorry that. So we will also include revolutionary movements in this fold. Remember what Bhagat Singh, Shahid Bhagat Singh, the great Bhagat Singh himself. Lots of revolutionaries laid down their lives, carrying out heroic deeds to strike fear in the hearts of the British. You must remember all that. Okay, so we will include all that in this particular section. Okay, it may feel that I am a bit overzealous. Okay, but I'll continue with that energy. That is what we require in classes. Okay, I don't want you guys to sleep or doze in between. Okay, days in between basically. So that is the energy that we'll be carrying forth with our classes. Okay. So I hope I have basically briefed you about the various aspects of modern India. We have looked at the relation of modern India, the importance of modern India as far as the UPSC is concerned. Okay, where we looked at the various the possibilities of or the various questions or the weightage of modern India as far as the UPSC examination is concerned. Okay, we have also looked at the importance of the subject as such, where I mentioned that the subject was a relatively easy one, given the candidate prepares in a proper, well-structured manner. Otherwise, it is going to be tedious because there are going to be a lot of factual information that one has to mug up. Now, my job here is to, one is to lay down those facts before you. The other is to highlight you or educate you about which ones to leave. Okay, it is equally important that a candidate knows which are the topics to leave. So in my classes, you will understand both which are the topics to prioritize and which of them you have to leave. Okay, so this is the rough sketch of my class. Okay, after which we looked at the various aspects or various parts of our various aspects of the subject, where we looked at the individual topics. We had a journey through the entire modern Indian history. Okay, so where we looked at the various sections starting from British consolidation in India, administrative changes brought by them. Okay, economic history, the economic deprivation that the country suffered in their hands, from their hands. The early nationalistic phase, where we're talking about the pre-Congress organization, the rise of the Congress, the moderate faction within the Congress, the extremist faction, etc. Also the later nationalistic phase, okay, where we witnessed the emergence of mass nationalism and the rise of Mahatma Gandhi, okay, and the leaders of that time, and great leaders of that time, okay, including Sardar Patel, Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, etc. Social reform organization can be considered as a parallel topic, where a number of people decided to change the various facets of society so as to modernize it. Okay, led by people like Ram Mohan Roy. Okay, we also looked at rebels and the Raj, where I had mentioned that there are lots of political discontent building up even prior to the development of the national movements, but most of the sentiments were regional. So that is why we've classified it as rebels and the Raj, where we can categorize it as three axes: civil rebellions, then comes civil rebellions, which includes peasant and tribal rebellions, then comes the rebellion by native states, including the revolt of 1857, of course. Then the third one, the revolutionary movements. This was something that took place in the nationalistic phase, but nonetheless we are including them in this section because of the nature of their tactics. It was the same tactic. All of them propagated the idea of violence, okay, to gain freedom. So I hope you have roughly understood the first part. So this is just a orientation for you guys with regards to the subject. Now we'll get into the nuances of the subject. We'll get into the first topic, okay, European penetration. Okay, so we're going to start our class. Everybody hold on tight. Okay, now okay, so European penetration into India. See, this is how the handout will be structured. There'll be, after each handout, there'll be a question from that particular section that will be asked. Okay, so basically these are questions that have come in the UPSC examination. So every section will carry certain questions from the UPSC examination, both from the prelims as well as mains. So this will give you enough fodder material to prepare on. Okay, this is how the handout will be layered. Okay, so at the end of each handout, there will be questions from UPSC examinations. Now, if the UPSC hasn't raised a question from that part, I will myself be giving you questions there. Okay, so every handout will literally have questions for you guys to practice. It is very essential that you guys practice these questions. Okay, there will be at least 1 to 2 questions. Okay, and some handouts there will be more. Okay, and we will have at the end of every topic, or at the end of every section, we will have a kind of, I will give you a set of mains questions which you guys have to answer by your own. You could send me the answers, okay, later on. So about that we'll be talking about later. We'll be dealing with that later. Now we'll start with our handouts. Okay, European penetration to India. The advent of the Europeans. The coming of the Europeans into India was an event of great importance in the history of our country. Is it? Yes, it is. What happened after that? We were colonized for 200 years after that. Okay, as it ultimately resulted into enslavement for 200 years, just as I was elaborating, or just as I elaborated now. Portugal was the first European power to reach the Indian shores. So my simple question is, what is the chronological order of their arrival? We'll just look at their chronological orders. Okay, we're going to elaborate on that later on in this particular handout, but we'll have a discussion about the date of, or the chronological order of their arrival. Okay, can you tell me what is the chronological order of their arrival? Now, who came first? So, who actually came first? The first European power to come to India was the Portuguese. Okay, 1498, if you remember, Vasco da Gama set foot in India at Calicut. Okay, a place in Malabar, that is northern Kerala. Okay, so remember that too. So this is how the European penetration starts. Okay, Kerala and Malabar was famous for its textile and spices. So of course Vasco da Gama was in search of both of them. See, India was the promised land of the Europeans. Okay, so that is why Vasco da Gama decides to embark on a long journey, long voyage, ultimately reaching the shores of India. Okay, that is one thing. Now, which is the next European power to come to India? The next European power to come to India was, of course, the Dutch, 1604. Okay, the Dutch came to India. Their company, Dutch Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or the Dutch East India Company, okay, was established in India. Okay, in 1604. We will be looking at their individual settlements, their important settlements, their historical importance and all that later on. This is just a rough chronological arrangement to give you guys a historical timeline. Okay. Now, who came next? Of course, the British, our colonial masters, came next, 1608. Okay. Next came the British. Okay. So please remember that too. We'll be looking at who set foot in India, who was the Britishman who came to India, and all that. Okay. Later on. This is just giving you a chronological arrangement. Okay. Now, next came the Danish. Okay. Surprisingly, many of you may not have been privy about that particular information. The Danish or the Danes or the people of Denmark, the kingdom of Denmark, actually embarked on a voyage into India and set foot in the country in 1620. Okay. But the empire didn't last long. That is why we are not privy about their existence in the country. But they did have certain settlements under them. They didn't have a grand colonial scheme in India, unlike their other predecessors, and was irrelevant for most part of it. Okay, that is why. But anyways, the Danish also had a sort of enterprise in India. Okay, 1620. The last comes the French. Okay, the French was the last to arrive and set foot in India. 1668. Okay, they set foot in India in 1668. The French. So, what is so important here? What you need to learn is you need to have a rough idea of when the European settlers came to India. You don't need to know the exact date. Know the chronological order of their arrival. Okay. So remember that it was the Portuguese who came first. So they came at the fag end of the 15th century. That will suffice. Almost 100 years later came the Dutch. Almost 5 years later, almost half a decade later came the British. Almost a decade later came the Danish. Almost 3 decades later came the French. So don't learn the dates by heart, but just have a rough chronological idea. Now many of you may have an inherent fear with the idea of chronology. I will give you certain tools to simplify your difficulty later on. There are certain tools that you can deploy to do it. Okay. We will talk about that later on as we progress in the subject. So don't worry about all that. For now, I have reassured you guys that you don't need to know the exact year by heart, or you don't need to memorize it, but rather have a rough estimate. Okay, I've told you what you need to know. So this is how you do it. Okay, so these are the 5 colonial enterprises which arrived in India, and we have arranged them in their chronological order. Okay. Now, let's go back. So, features of European penetration. One must remember that all the European powers, all the European imperial powers were hostile to each other, adversarial to each other, and were after the same set of goods. It was not that some of them had different objectives. No, all of them are the same objectives. You must remember, when does competition increase? Competition only increases when people are after the same set of goods, or people are manufacturing the same set of goods. If I were to manufacture a toothpaste and you were to manufacture a brush, there wouldn't be any competition between us. It would be all harmonious and good. But if I were to manufacture a toothpaste and you were to manufacture the same thing, then there will be competition. There will be price wars. So that is what happened. Almost all European powers who came to India at different time periods were after the same set of goods and items. Okay. The only difference was that they prioritized in their own way, but they were after the same set of things. Okay, that is why there was intense competition and rivalry between them. So don't think that the Europeans came to India and they coordinated and cooperated with each other and slowly eliminated the regional powers. No, they competed with each other and outmaneuvered each other later on, seeking the help of assistance of the regional powers, later on eliminating them. And after that, this competition, the ultimate victor among the competitors was of course the British, who then managed to subsequently create a colonial empire. Okay, so this is the story, okay, of the entire thing. So they were mutual competitors, very hostile towards each other. They were more hostile towards each other than any other trading group. Okay, There were Indians, there were Arabs, there were Turks, but they were mutually hostile towards each other more than anyone else. Okay, so that is something that one must remember. Now, features of European penetration. The first thing, what was their major goal? Monopolization of trade. Okay, the major goal was to monopolize trade. Now, what is monopolization? Establishing dominance over a set of goods. Okay, they wanted to monopolize and cartelize trade in India. Okay, that was their major goal and objective. That is why there was mutual rivalry and hostility. They tried eliminating each other and also other trade rivals. Now, who are the other trade rivals who had a significant presence in India before the arrival of the Europeans? Can you tell me who are the other trading powers who are there? One, of course, the Arabs. Okay, the Egyptians, the Turks, etc. Okay. Now, let me give you an idea. What was the trading scenario of the time? See, let's imagine that I am a trader from Kerala. Okay. Now, I have decided to sell a set of products to a certain trader from a foreign nation. Okay. Now, initially what happened was that the Arabs used to come to India. Okay. The Arabs used to come to India. The first trading scenario. Okay. Initially the trading scenario was like the Arabs used to come to Arabs used to come to India, Arabs and Turks majorly. They traded with the Indians. Okay. Or the Indians traded with them. Okay. What were the goods? What are the major goods that were traded? Let's look at what are the major goods that were traded. Spices. Then what else? Textiles, of course. Okay. Then what else? Spices, textiles. What else was traded? What were the other important items that were traded? Opium. Okay, opium was a drug. Of course, the opium was traded only. Opium trade became very prominent only later on after the Europeans established their dominance over the country, especially the British. But whatever. So these are the common items of trade here. Okay. So there were a set of goods that were traded, that were majorly traded from India. Okay. And set of goods that were transacted to India. Now the Arabs and the Turks bought goods from India. Okay. What did we get in return? Majorly gold coins, silver. That is why Indians have a traditional craze for gold, because we used to transact our goods and what we demand in return was majorly gold and bullion. That is why we have craze for gold. Okay. Even Pliny the Elder, one Roman senator during the early years, so if you remember, the Roman Empire in the ancient times used to have a very strong trade with India. Okay. One Roman senator of the name Pliny even lamented that the entire treasury of Rome was being drained into India because of the demand for Indian spices, especially pepper. Okay, so remember that too. So these are certain items that were traded. Now, Arabs and Turks, they were traded. So there are lots of other items, but just know the major ones. Okay, that is how the UPSC frames the question. They are not going to ask very, very unique items. Okay, this is how they ask the questions. Now, sometimes these traders also took precious stones. Okay, but that too very rarely. But anyways, precious stones. So these are items of trade. Now, the Arabs and Turks took these goods and transacted with the Egyptians. Okay. Of course, the Egyptians are at the boundary or the juncture between Asia and Europe. So that is why they are very important, strategically important. So the Arabs, and you must remember that if, for example, they acquired a set of goods from India for 4 ducats, ducat being an ancient Arab coin. Okay, so imagine that they acquired, these goods were bought at 4 ducats. You don't need to know the name of the currency. I'm just giving you an example. 4 ducats from India. Okay, they were transacted by the Indian. They were given by the Indians, or they were sold by the Indians to Arabs and Turks at 4 ducats. The Arabs and Turks used to sell it at 12 ducats to the Europeans. So thrice the amount. Okay, look at the exponential profits that they earned with their transaction with the Egyptians. Now the Egyptians used to sell it to Genoese or Venetian traders, okay, who were basically Portuguese and the Italians, Genoese traders, okay, Venetian and Genoese traders, who bought it at around the price of 40 ducats. Okay, so Egyptians transacted at around 40 ducats. See the explosion of profits, more than 3 times. Okay, so see the explosion of profits. Now the Venetian and Genoese traders used to transact these goods to European markets. Now do you know what was the profit that, what was the, what was the inflationary cost that had come by that time? 80 ducats. Okay, so the cost had exploded to 80 ducats when it reached Europe. What was the initial cost? 4. What was the final cost? 80. So around 20 times the original amount. That was transacted in India was the transaction value of that in Europe. Okay, so this is the kind of value that Indian goods had elsewhere, especially in the Middle East and Europe, and that trade was completely dominated by the Arabs and the Turks. That is why the European seafarers wanted to find a sea route to India, so as to undertake direct trade transactions with the country, which would then earn them high profits. Okay, this particular trade could have been done more profitably. Okay, had they did it directly. Okay, so these Europeans wanted a piece of this profit. Okay, so that is what happened here. I hope you have understood. You don't need to jot this down, but this is something I have given you for you guys to understand. Okay, so let's continue. Now, so the Arabs, Egyptians, now they wanted to monopolize trade. So now we have realized why they wanted to monopolize trade. Now monopolization, the concept of monopolization only applies where there is competition. That is, the producer selling the same item. That is where there is monopolization. I hope you have understood that. Okay. So now why was there monopolization? Because of common items of trade. Items of trade were common. We have already discussed about some of them. Which were they? Spices, of course, especially pepper. Now why was pepper called black gold? Because pepper was invaluable to the Europeans. Why so? Can you tell me? Because pepper was used as an item of preservation. One must remember that you didn't have refrigerators during that time, and Europe had very cold winters where even agriculture was not possible. So what they did, they used to mainly forage and hunt. Okay, and when they hunted, they wanted to preserve their meat, because animal capture was not always, or animals were not always available during the winter. It was very difficult to forage out, or it was very difficult to travel a long distance and then hunt and catch a prey. It was very difficult during that time because of the cold winters. That is why they wanted a preservative. Where pepper came in. Pepper was a natural preservative to preserve meat especially. Okay, that is why it was of high value. And spices could only be found in tropical nations. So this is why the Europeans attributed a large value to this item. So spices, pepper, cardamom, all of which were important. Okay, these were important items of trade. Now, what else? Textiles. Now, textiles could be divided into two actually. How would you divide textiles? One being cotton, the other being silk. Okay, silk was a high value textile. Now, cotton textiles, 3 varieties were most transacted. What were they? One variety founded in the Malabar coast known as calico. The city of Calicut earns its name from this particular textile, calico. Okay, then comes the next cotton textile. What is it? A very famous cotton textile found in Coromandel coast, chins. Okay, if you were to visit Pondicherry, you would know that this is a very luxurious textile item. See, the kind of price that they quote for it is unbelievable. Okay, maybe a handkerchief made of chins would cost you 1,000 rupees, roughly 1,000 rupees. This is the kind of cost that is there for this particular item. This kind of how expensive that is. Okay, And so chins. So this is another textile export item. Now what else? Muslin. This was a coarse textile item that was manufactured in Bengal mainly. The muslin is actually basically known after a city, Dhaka. Dhaka became a very famous textile manufacturing hub due to its capability to manufacture this very item, muslin. So these were the three cotton textile varieties that was of great demand for the Europeans. So we are not talking about raw cotton here, we are talking about cotton textiles here. Okay, so we transacted finished goods. That's why we earned a lot of foreign income via that mechanism. Okay, so please remember that too. So India had a big trade during this time. So calico, chins and muslin, very important cotton textiles. Now along with it, we also talked about opium being a very important trade item. See, opium was majorly transacted with China. You must remember that. Okay, opium was a major trade item with China. We will be elaborating about opium trade later on, because opium trade became a well-established mechanism only after the East India Company gained a foothold in Bengal. Okay, one must remember that too. We will be talking about that later on. Just remember that opium was a trading item with China majorly, and Indians played the role of intermediaries, where the East India Company or the European powers used to acquire opium from India and then sell it to China in return for certain goods. Okay, so this was another trade item. Another very important trade item was saltpeter. Do you know what saltpeter is? It is the most important constituent of gunpowder. Okay, so if you needed to manufacture gunpowder, you needed saltpeter. Okay, and India and China are the largest reserves of this particular item. By that time, Europe had slowly transitioned into the gunpowder age, where a lot of gunpowder based weapons were made. This is what gave them the military superiority over their Asian rivals. You must remember that too. Okay, they slowly and steadily progressed in their military warfare, modernizing their weapons, achieving a significant upper hand when compared to their Asian counterparts, okay, and Asian rivals. That is why in the 17th century or in the 18th century, they had a significant upper hand over us, because their weapons are much more modernized, their military tactics much more much more well laid out. Okay, it was much more modern and well drilled, the military tactics. Okay, that is why they finally managed to conquer the country. Okay, so saltpeter, very important trade item. So remember that too. So these were the common items of trade that were there. All the early European powers wanted to monopolize trade over these items. Okay, so remember that too. Now, many European powers like Portugal, who were Catholic nations, also wanted to promote Christianity in Asia. Okay, so promotion of Christianity was one important tenet. Okay, that is why they described the Asians as being Orientals, okay, or non-Christians. So we were basically non-Christians. Our culture was very diverse when compared to the Western culture and all that. That is why we were described as Orientals. We had our own set of cultural beliefs, language systems, religious beliefs, etc. Okay, that is why we were described to be Orientals. So Orientals is actually a European interpretation of what Asia is. It is not actually what Asia is. Okay, it's a European interpretation. They would say that this is the Oriental law. See, many of our texts have been translated by the British, especially religious and cultural texts. So there are certain problems attached to it, okay, attached to those translations, because it is their interpretation of what Indian culture is. It is rather they do apply a lot of scientific methods, but nonetheless there are certain flaws with regards to such translations. Okay, that is because they believe that this is our culture. They attribute or they try imposing on us the culture, on us the belief that this is our cultural makeup. Okay, so they derogated the Indian culture to a large extent through their intellectual critiques. We'll talk about that much later. Okay, so promotion of Christianity. What is civilization mission? They wanted to civilize the uncivilized. They felt that the Asian civilizations, or especially the Oriental civilizations of the Far East, were uncivilized, including the Indians. We believed in a set of pagan gods, as they would describe us. We were pagan worshippers. Okay, so they felt that that was going against their religious, professed religious tenets. Okay, so the Europeans wanted to reform the country by imposing their set of cultural traditions. Okay, so this is the kind of idea that prevails. So civilization mission, they want to civilize the country, which meant that they were civilized. Okay, this is actually racial segregation, which meant that the Europeans were already civilized and the others weren't. So it was their inherent duty, intrinsic religious duty to civilize the others. This is the kind of message that they gave out, especially to Asian people, that they were out to civilize people and not to conquer. Okay, very bizarre explanation to their colonial exploitation. Okay, very bizarre explanation attributed to colonial exploitation. Dissemination of Christianity, I've already mentioned about that. Okay, so the Portuguese literally tried proselytizing Christianity in the country, or literally tried undertaking Christian conversions, disseminating the religion in the country. That is what happened there. That is why they were very unpopular with the Indian masses, unlike the British. Okay, we'll talk about that much later. We'll give a standard comparison between both powers much later. I'll take a comparison. Now, that is another thing. Now, how did they monopolize trade? How can you monopolize trade? You can monopolize trade by giving stiff competition. Okay, what is one way? See, I earlier mentioned an example about my toothpaste being a competitor to your toothpaste. If my toothpaste has a better outcome altogether, it is highly likely that my toothpaste would be consumed by you all. Or if it is branded better, advertised better, then too the consumer will be inclined to purchase my particular brand. Okay, so that these are some ways that you can do it. There are also other ways. Okay, how can you monopolize otherwise? By forcing the other product to go off the market. How do you do that? You try influencing the political dispensation out there in some way so as to impose a ban on the other product. So if you were to release a product and I were to use my political influence to ban your product, then I could monopolize that sector or that arena. What did the British do? They didn't try improving their trade practices. Or what did the Europeans do? They never tried improving their trade practices. Albeit they had a superior there are superior merchandise ships, but they never tried improving their trade. They tried imposing their will on others. They forcefully monopolized trade by deploying their naval warships. Okay, am I clear? So this is something that they did. So their monopoly was actually forced on the Asians. That is, they established their naval supremacy in the Indian Ocean. They had a much superior navy when compared to any Asian power. That is why they managed to go on their colonial ventures. They had a much superior navy when compared to any Asian power, undoubtedly. Okay, so this is something that you must understand. They enforced their will on the country. See, in the process, they eliminated the earlier competitors such as the Arabs and the Turks. They basically drove them away. Okay, they even tried excluding the Indian traders. Okay, who were forced to now do trade with the Europeans, but on their own terms, on the terms of the Europeans. Okay, this is how they managed to monopolize the trade out here. So they established naval supremacy. It was forced trade. One must remember that Asian trade before the arrival of the Europeans actually encouraged free or open trade. Asian trade was always open. Okay, we never placed strict restrictions against any power. Okay, maybe if we had a rivalry, things would have been different. But otherwise, our trading scenario is always open. See, the Arabs never tried eliminating the Turks forcefully. They never did that. Okay, they tried increasing their political influence in the region that they traded with. Okay, that is what they did, so that they would get concessions. But they never tried imposing their naval supremacy over the other power in order to eliminate their trade competition. But the Europeans were the ones to actually introduce this. That is why you could say that the Europeans modified the Asian trade scenario and introduced closed trade. Okay, so that is something that is important. That is something that is very important. It was the Europeans who introduced closed trade. Okay, trading scenario, Europeans introduced closed trade. Okay, now I hope you've understood that part. Now let's look at the next thing, principle of mercantilism. Now what is the principle of mercantilism? Very important philosophy. See, the principle of mercantilism was a philosophy that prevailed during that time. Okay. What is mercantilism? Can you say what mercantilism is? Mercantilism was a philosophy that prevailed during that time. Okay. Now, what were the various tenets of mercantilism? I would say that one thing that was part of mercantilism was what? Now, what is mercantilism? Mercantilism was a very important economic philosophy, economic and trading philosophy that prevailed in Europe during this time, that prevailed all around Europe. See, like the name suggests, this is actually a trade philosophy. Okay. Now, what is its main tenet? What is its main idea? How was it conceived? See, its main idea is that the primary purpose of a nation is to accumulate wealth. Okay, the primary objective of a nation is to accumulate wealth. Okay, accumulate wealth. Now, how do you accumulate wealth? By accumulating bullion. By accumulating bullion. What is bullion? Coinage, currency. Okay, so you had to accumulate gold coins or currency in order to accumulate wealth. Only if you accumulate wealth can you provide for your citizens. Now, how do you accumulate wealth? That was the next question that came about. Now, how do you accumulate wealth? You accumulate wealth via trade, transactions, for which you require manufacturing. Okay, for trade, the country requires manufacturing. So the country needed to manufacture products in order to trade. Okay, so please remember that. Now, so it was via trade transactions that it was via manufacturing that you could actually trade products. Now, what is the issue with this particular philosophy? Can you tell me? The issue with this particular philosophy is that, see, one must remember that manufacturing was always limited during the time. Manufacturing had a limited growth during the time. Do you know why so? Because manufacturing was majorly manual. It was done by human beings. Okay, manufacturing was majorly manual. So what was the major inhibitor against the increase of manufacturing? It is population growth. One must remember that population growth was always limited in the medieval eras. Do you know when population exploded? It only exploded for the first time in the 18th century. Okay, it exploded during the time of the 18th century. Okay, after which there was a population increase. Up till then, there was a steady trend of increase and decrease. You couldn't say that population increased by a large extent. It did increase, but by a very small extent. Okay, in certain centuries, population was even reduced due to the spread of epidemics. Okay, So population very gradually increased up till the 18th century. After the world witnessed an explosion, especially Europe. Okay, it was only in the 20th century that Asia witnessed an explosion of population. Okay, so please remember that too. So manufacturing was limited because population growth was limited. Now, when manufacturing was limited, trade transaction would also become limited. It would always be limited. One couldn't help it. If manufacturing was limited, trade transaction was limited. Ultimately, okay. So these are mechanism won't be a separate. There was a question in world history years before, but you must remember that mechanism is just a trading philosophy. Okay. Now I'll give you the full picture after I complete the explanation. Okay. So trade transactions were limited as manufacturing was limited as the country couldn't manufacture or the country couldn't increase its manufacturing capacity manifold. It didn't have the ability because population growth was limited. Okay. Now, why was population growth limited? Now we are getting to something else. Okay. So I hope I will just summarize what I've said so far. Mechanism is an economic trading philosophy that was prevalent in Europe during these eras. Okay. The principle of mechanism, the prime objective of mechanism, or the prime objective that mechanism promotes is the idea that accumulation of wealth is most important for a country, and you can accumulate wealth only by accumulating bullion. Okay, so profits was the most important thing. You needed to increase your profits like anything. Okay, in order to sustain. Now, how could you sustain profits? It is by increasing the manufacturing of your products. Okay, increasing the manufacturing products, increasing the number of products that you manufacture. Is that possible? No, because manufacturing was manual and there was a limit to population growth during that time. So, so trade could never grow via this particular means. So manufacturing growth would never be infinite according to the mercantilists. So this would be problematic because at some point the nation would reach its ceiling. Okay. So beyond which there would not be any growth. Growth would basically, what would happen to growth? Growth would slowly taper out. Okay. Or it would achieve a new, or growth it would not increase anymore. Okay. So this is the kind of issues that the then traders or the then economists faced, the early economists faced. So they did not know what to do. Okay. Now, so trade transaction was limited because manufacturing was limited. Now, this philosophy was backed by another concept known as, and see, there are certain demographic transition theories. You must remember that. Okay, there are certain demographic population theories, which was the most popular population theory prior to the current ideas. The most popular population theory was Malthus's philosophy, Malthusian theory actually. Okay, Malthusian population theory. What does that talk about? Malthus simply says that population growth will never be infinite or indefinite. Population growth will always stabilize. Do you know why so? Because he believed that population growth was in AP or arithmetic progression. Sorry, population growth was in GP or geometric progression, whereas food grains growth would be in AP, which would mean that population growth would grow in geometric progression. Okay, which is exponential growth of population to just manifold growth of food grains. So food grains growth would be in AP. So what would happen? Many of us would die of hunger. Okay, and population would be stabilized. So believe that per capita income would also remain stable. Per capita income could never be increased beyond a particular measure. This is known as Malthusian trap. Okay, this is what you call as Malthusian trap. You can never increase per capita beyond a certain extent because your population growth would be limited. Because your population growth was limited, your population growth was limited because food grain growth was limited. So population would always be stabilized. Your population could never increase its per capita beyond a certain extent because manufacturing would always become limited as manufacturing was dependent on population growth. So that was the prevalent philosophy. Another prevalent philosophy which backed this idea. Okay, so mercantilism also gained its recognition from Malthus's idea. Okay, can you understand that? Can you relate both? Okay, so this is the idea that prevailed in Europe during this time. So now what was the only way that a country could grow in such a scenario? The only way that a country could grow was by exploitation and monopolization of trade. The only way a country could grow was by exploiting a third country and monopolizing trade. Okay, so you had to suck away the resources of another country in order to sustain, because you couldn't go beyond a certain limit. So you had to basically take away or erode the resource of another country to your own so as to accumulate wealth. So this is what promoted the idea of colonialism and imperialism during the early eras. Now do you understand what happened? Okay, so if trade growth was limited, the only way a country could accumulate wealth without this was by exploiting a third nation, okay, and draining away its resources. This is as simple as that. Okay, so it is this philosophy that led to the growth of such colonial enterprises like the East India Company. Okay, they wanted to establish a monopoly over trade over a certain area because they felt that only by monopolizing could they earn exorbitant profits. Okay, so that is why you call these enterprises as the military trade enterprises. Okay, they are known as military trade enterprises, state military enterprise, whatever, military trade enterprises. Okay, they had both military and naval powers as well as they were trading enterprises. So military trading state, a state military, all this evolved during this time. Okay, so armies developed, navies, the British or the Europeans decided to concentrate on their navies in order to support this particular idea and support their traders. Okay, so that they can monopolize trade elsewhere. Okay, so this is the idea that came about. So this is mercantilism. So what does mercantilism ultimately say? Mercantilism ultimately says that the only way that you could accumulate wealth is by exploiting the wealth of a third person. Okay, and what did that mean? It meant monopolization of trade. It also meant that particular country protects its domestic industries. So it talked about protecting its domestic industries. So mercantilism talked about protecting the domestic industries from competition abroad. See, that is why when Indian manufactured goods or textile goods were transacted to a very large extent, the British decided to bring in certain laws to curb it. You may have heard about the Calico Acts. Remember the Calico Acts? Okay, in order to protect the domestic industries, the British decided to pass certain legislations like the Calico Act. Okay, please remember that. The Calico Act was related to all this. Something that was related to all this. Okay, so remember this thing. Okay, so these are certain developments that took place during that time. Protecting of domestic industries and all that. Now, so mercantilism I hope is clear. Now let's move on. So these are the various features of European penetration, starting from monopolization trade. Monopolization of trade took place because there are common items of demand. Common items included spices, textiles, saltpeter, opium, etc. Precious metals too. Okay, cotton textiles, we had three varieties of textiles, one being Coromandel chintz, the other being Dhaka muslin, and third being of course calico, very important textile. See, it is in order to prevent the trading of calico. See, women were so crazy about calico women were so crazy about calico at one time in England that the English passed a Calico Act whereby it was made a crime to possess a textile which was made of calico. Okay, it was a crime. An extra taxation had to be paid by the customer if if he or she was found in possession of such a textile. She had to pay a fee. Okay. Exorbitant customs duties are placed on calico due to its demand in England. Okay, that is why William Defoe laments, the novelist of the author of Robinson Crusoe laments that Indian textile and calico is actually destroying the English market. Okay, so now what is the next point we saw? How did you monopolize? You monopolize by bringing in your military state complex, that is establishing naval supremacy in the Indian Ocean. So the trading company also came along with naval warships so as to drive away other trading competitors via forceful intervention. Okay, so they would basically drive away their competitors very unfairly, very unjudiciously. Okay, remember that too. Now, we also saw that one other goal of the British or of the European enterprises was to disseminate Christianity into the Far East. Okay, this was especially true with regards to the Catholic powers, including Portugal and to a lesser extent France. Okay, but later on the British too did try carrying on such activities, but to a lesser extent. Okay, civilization mission. What is civilization mission? The Europeans professed that since the Oriental East was uncivilized, practicing pagan religions, it was the duty of every it was a duty of such it was a duty of the West to civilize the East. Okay, thus they created critiques against the Eastern culture, portraying it in a very poor light. Okay, so remember that too. The last one we learned about mercantilism in detail. Okay, the trading philosophy mercantilism. Am I clear there? So mercantilism talked about closed trade. It talked about protecting domestic industries while exploiting the wealth of third nations. Okay, so as to accumulate wealth, since population growth was always limited and manufacturing due to this particular development would always remain limited. Okay, so remember this. Now, can you tell me when mercantilism slowly started losing its relevance? It was, of course, in the background of the industrial revolution. After when people or when industrialists or when entrepreneurs found out that they could deploy machines to improve productivity and also enhance the scale of production, this philosophy immediately lost its relevance, because you no more needed a population explosion to actually improve manufacturing. Okay, you only needed to innovate on it. Okay, that is how this philosophy lost its relevance. That is how free trade comes into the picture. Okay, because it was no longer relevant to protect the domestic industries, but rather allow free trade with other areas who have less developed industries, so that those industries would be destroyed without protection. That is the idea of free trade. Okay, so there's a flip side to it too. See, when the European powers decided to open up trade with other countries, these countries were lesser developed. Okay, they had a relatively nascent manufacturing industry, so they managed to basically penetrate, or they managed to penetrate. They created or they inundated these areas with their products, with their textile products, which carried a lower price because of manufacturing, because of the manufacturing capabilities. If you manufacture machines, your scale of production increases, which reduces the prices. Okay, so now what happened was that these third world nations or these colonized nations lost their industries. They were deindustrialized because of the inundation of British products or inundation of colonial products from European powers. So it had a flip side too. When free trade came about, it destroyed the rest of the world except Europe. Okay, so that too is something that is to be remembered. Now, civilization, mission and dissemination of Christianity, remember that too. So this is about it. Okay, so let's move on. The Portuguese in India. Now let's look at the reasons. Now we have looked at the common factors of European penetration. Let's look at the reasons why there was a plateau. There was basically a large interest in finding, or there was basically an increased interest in exploration in the Indian Ocean, and also to find an alternate sea route to India. Okay, what was the necessity to find out an alternate sea route to India? I have already mentioned that the Romans had established firm trade contacts in the subcontinent. So do you think that the Europeans were unaware about a sea route? They already had the Mediterranean sea route. So why find out, why the sudden interest in exploration? Why was Vasco da Gama's arrival in India considered to be such a big thing? If it had been already done by other European travelers before him, or other European powers before him. The Roman Empire had a lot of trade with the subcontinent. So why is Vasco da Gama's achievement that important? Now we'll now move on to such facts. Okay, so the reason why the Europeans came a long way, or the Europeans decided to undertake a large set of explorations. Now we look into the reasons. So, reasons. Can you tell me some of the reasons? One reason could be that the traditional sea route was blocked, or there was a blockade in their traditional sea route. Now, who might have contributed to such a development, to blockade in the traditional sea route? Who might have contributed to such a development? Can you tell me? There was a unique reason why there was an increasing need for. Basically, Vasco da Gama's venture to India was not the first one. It was part of a set of explorations, which in itself highlights the fact that there was something happening in continental Europe that was driving people, that was driving these voyages. So what was the necessity to find out an alternate sea route? That was because the traditional sea route which was blockaded. What was the traditional route? The traditional sea route, that is the Mediterranean sea route, was now blockaded. What happened there? What happened there? There, in the Mediterranean, a new regional power had ascended. Okay, which was this regional power? It was the Ottoman Turks. So the rise of the Ottoman Turks, which was an Islamic kingdom, okay, which was a very strong Islamic kingdom and gave stiff competition to the Europeans, led to the blockading of the traditional sea route. Turkey, as you know, is in the juncture there. Turkey is a country in the Mediterranean Sea, and thus has a lot to do with trade there. Okay, so they simply blockaded the trade route there. Okay, which discouraged European traders to travel through that. Okay, so they placed a trade embargo. The rise of the Ottoman Turks led to the blockading of traditional sea route. So what happened then? Thus the Europeans decided to embark on an alternate sea route. Now where did they find this alternate sea route from? Alternate sea route by circumnavigating the continent of Africa. See, literally they circled around the continent of Africa to reach India, when it would have been much simpler for them to travel to the Mediterranean Sea. But that was not possible because of the blockading of that sea route. That is why there was a sudden interest in finding out an alternate sea route to India. Because by the time of the 15th century, the Ottomans had firmly established their power in the Mediterranean. In the 16th century, they had completely blockaded the sea route. So there was no alternate sea route. That is why the Genoese and the Venetian traders and all of them, or the Portuguese Empire, decided to embark on a journey to find out an alternate sea route so as to undertake direct trade with India, which was considered to be one of the most potential markets or potential producers for the European nations, or considered to be one of the most potential economic powers of the time. Okay, that is why Portugal decided to embark on such a journey, and the Portuguese travelers were well known for their seafaring capabilities. Portuguese and Spanish travelers during that time, they were much more well equipped and modernized than the British and the French during that time. Okay, so this circumnavigating Africa. Okay, crossing the Indian Ocean, reaching India. Okay, this was the sea route, one of the most difficult and tedious journeys of the time. Okay, who ultimately succeeded in discovering the sea route? It was Vasco da Gama. Now you realize the importance of Vasco da Gama. He was the first one to circumnavigate Africa, then cross the Indian Ocean to reach the shores of India, which was considered to be a daunting task during that time. Many of his predecessors failed. People like Bartholomew Dias, who literally sacrificed his life for the very journey. He ultimately, unfortunately, he couldn't complete his journey. He reached the Cape of Storms, that is near South Africa. He felt that had he circumnavigated Africa, he would have seen the continent of India or the country of India. But unfortunately, he couldn't. He was very disappointed. He only had carried provisions up to that point. Ultimately, his ship sank in a storm there. Okay, so he lost his life. But his journal inspired other travelers to embark on their own journey. Ultimately, Vasco da Gama managed to find his way to India. Do you know that Christopher Columbus actually decided to find an alternate sea route by circumnavigating the globe? He decided to travel around the globe so as to find an alternate sea route. So he went on a different direction. Instead of circumnavigating Africa, he felt that, during that time the world was flat. So he felt that if he would try circumnavigating Africa, he would fall off the earth, the surface of the earth. So he felt that there was an alternate sea route by going through an opposite direction. That is why he decided to travel in the other way and ultimately managed to discover the continent of America. Rediscover the continent, or you could never say that he discovered the continent of America, because there are lots of people inhabiting there. This is just a European terminology that people use. Who discovered America and all that nonsense. Okay, America already existed there. There are indigenous people who lived there too, who had their own set of beliefs and political systems. Okay, so nonetheless, Christopher Columbus managed to land in the continent of America, thinking that was India. He cried, "This is the golden land that I was setting out for. This is India." That is what he shouted when he reached that particular land. Okay, it was only years later that another traveler, Amerigo Vespucci from Italy, when he landed there, he realized that was not India. So he named the continent after him. That is why it is today known as America. It is named after Amerigo Vespucci. You don't need to know all these facts. These are all just trivia that we will be discussing on our journey on our journey. Interesting trivia. This will help you stay interested, glued to the class. Okay, so remember this. So Vasco da Gama. Now, what was the other reason? What was the other necessity? Can you tell me? See, something very important happened during this time or prior to this era. What happened prior to this era? It was the Renaissance. Okay. Now, what is the Renaissance? Can you tell me what Renaissance means? The Renaissance, what happened? This was the time when the Renaissance spread all around Europe, and this was the age of enlightenment. Okay, the 17th century and the 18th century can also be described as the age of enlightenment, when great thinkers emerged all around Europe. People like Immanuel Kant, Baruch Spinoza. Okay, people like that. We are talking about great thinkers. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu, Diderot. Okay, people like that. So there were lots of intellectuals who emerged during this time. So this was a time of Renaissance. Now, what is Renaissance basically? It is a set of progressive, socio-political, cultural changes that happened across Europe. Starting from the 16th century. Okay, it started from Florence basically. Okay, so there are multiple number of reasons for the Renaissance to happen, which is not part of our academic discourse. That is not required for a world history class too. So we will not be discussing about that part. Okay. See, what happened was that there was a sudden change. There are multiple reasons, okay, which led to that change. It is because of a long set of progressive. It was a long set of. It was because of a long. It was a long evolution basically. Okay, which started from the 12th century with the emergence of certain Christian thinkers. Okay, and after which Saint Augustus being one of them. Okay, so there are lots of Christian thinkers who came during that time who gave a different picture altogether of Christianity, and it started from the church, and then slowly and steadily there was an intellectual movement that happened after the fall of. Okay, there are lots of stories attached to it. Now, so Renaissance. The Renaissance set upon, and by the 17th century, it had spread all around Europe. Do you know why so? That was because of the spread of print culture actually. See, in the 18th century, print culture had developed in Europe, which led to the dissemination of progressive ideas, led to the establishment of education institutions. People started encouraging education. Okay, kings, native states started encouraging education. Okay, so this is something that you must remember. So now, as part of the Age of Enlightenment and Renaissance, there are lots of. Or can you tell me the characteristics of the Age of Enlightenment or Renaissance? One characteristic was that. What happened? Rationalism and reasoning now was considered to be. Rationalism and reasoning now gained significant traction. Okay, remember that the old Greek philosophies, which was enunciated by people like Plato, now began to re-emerge during this time. People like Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, all of them were now studied with a renewed interest. Okay, so like that, rationalism and reasoning now attained importance in all around Europe. Now, what else? Rationalism and reasoning. Now, what else can you say? Can you tell me any other reason? Okay, see, now what happened was that there was a print culture, that is something else that we have discussed, and also because of this, there was an increase in scientific innovation. Rationalism and reasoning naturally leads to scientific innovation, including maritime innovation. Okay, so better ships were built. Now people were more inquisitive to take up journeys. Okay, better ships were built. People were more inquisitive to take up journeys and all that. People are now taking up journeys. Okay, because we were more inquisitive to take such things up. Okay, so remember that too. Maritime innovation. Now, what else? What else can you say? We've learned this so far. Now, what else can you say? Okay, along with it, a growth of classicism. Okay, a growth of classicism. Okay, classicism is a renewed interest in the traditions of the medieval eras. Okay, there was a renewed interest, which did not mean that this was revivalism. No, there was a renewed interest in the traditions of the medieval eras, especially with regards to painting, architecture, etc. Okay, that is how many styles emerged. Okay, classicism re-emerged during this time, along with the Renaissance time, classicism and skepticism basically. Emergence of skepticism. Now, what is skepticism? Critiquing various facts. Even religion had to be submitted to the two benchmarks of rationalism and reasoning. Now, people started trying to reorder religion in such a way so as to become more appealing to the educated. Now, they had to submit religion to tests like rationalism and reasoning. Okay, that is how Europe grew more progressive, and education came to be considered as a very important tenet. Okay, so now the upper class, the elites started becoming educated. They started giving importance to education. They started investing in education institutions. Many of the educated class now became literate. You could literally see the emergence of the elites, including the nobles. Okay, the clergymen. You can see more the emergence of the educated class now. Okay, so this is what happened during that time. So this is what encouraged Renaissance and then exploration. I've already mentioned scientific innovation, further exploration. So there was a renewed interest to undertake exploration. Okay, this is another reason that led to an increasing reason for an increasing interest in exploring India. Okay, now, so let's look at the third reason. What other reason? We've already talked about religion. See, that is the most probable reason that we've already talked about. Religion. Could you say that religion had a reason? Yes. Spreading of Christianity. Very important reason that we already talked about. Civilization, mission and dissemination of Christianity. Spreading of Christianity into the East. And another factor was trade. Trade interests, of course. So these are factors that we already know about. So these are all factors that drove the Europeans to embark on various journeys. But we have looked at certain unique reasons, including the blockade of the sea route by the Ottoman Turks and the Renaissance. Okay, these are unique reasons that a candidate is unlikely to have come across during his preparation phase, which you must understand. Okay, spreading of Christianity is another reason that we have already talked about, and trade interest. These are all reasons. So I hope you have understood this particular section. So these are the reasons that led to the European venture into India. The circumnavigation part is what made it special. Okay, am I clear there? So let's stop our class for today. We'll continue with our class tomorrow. I hope you all had a good time. Please do revise the handout that I have already sent to your group. Okay, post doubts if you have any. Thank you for attending this session.